Hello, I'm Xavier from Great American Classics. Today we're going to talk about something called Japan's worst nightmare in World War II, America's Ghost Fleet. Now this is a story that doesn't always get the attention it deserves, even though the men who lived it and the boats they served on probably did more to defeat Japan than almost any other branch of the American military. These were the submarines, the silent hunters that prowled beneath the Pacific, striking without warning and vanishing into the deep. The Japanese came to fear them more than anything else, and with good reason. So let's take a look back and try to understand what those men went through and why it mattered so much to the outcome of the war. When the Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor on December 7, 1941, they accomplished something remarkable in military terms. They crippled the American battleship fleet in a single morning, sinking or damaging 8 battleships and killing over 2,000 American servicemen. It was a devastating blow, and it was meant to knock the United States out of the Pacific for long enough that Japan could consolidate its conquests and build an empire that would be too strong to challenge. But in their focus on the battleships, the Japanese made a critical oversight. They didn't destroy the fuel storage tanks at Pearl Harbor, which held millions of gallons of oil that would have taken months or years to replace. They didn't catch the American aircraft carriers, which happened to be at sea that day and would become the decisive weapons of the Pacific War. And they didn't pay much attention to the submarine base, where the boats and facilities that would eventually strangle Japan's war economy sat largely untouched. At the time, nobody fully appreciated how important that last oversight would prove to be. Submarines in 1941 were still something of an uncertain quantity in naval warfare. They had been used with devastating effect by Germany in World War I, sinking Allied shipping and nearly bringing Britain to its knees before the convoy system and American intervention turned the tide. But the submarine technology of that era was primitive by later standards, and many naval theorists believed that advances in anti-submarine warfare, particularly sonar and depth charges, had rendered submarines obsolete, or at least greatly reduced their effectiveness. The major naval powers had built their fleets around battleships and, increasingly, aircraft carriers. Submarines were seen as useful for reconnaissance, for picking off isolated targets, and perhaps for defending coastlines, but not as war-winning weapons in their own right. The United States Navy shared this view to a large extent. American submarines were well built and reasonably capable, but the doctrine for using them was cautious and defensive. Submarine commanders were trained to be careful, to avoid unnecessary risks, to preserve their boats rather than press aggressive attacks. This made a certain amount of sense in peacetime, when every submarine was expensive and took years to build, but it was exactly the wrong mentality for the kind of war that was about to begin. The American submarine force in the Pacific at the start of the war numbered about 51 boats, a mix of older S-class submarines and newer fleet boats like the Tambor and Gato classes. The fleet boats were impressive vessels for their time, over 300 feet long, capable of cruising at 20 knots on the surface and 8 or 9 knots submerged, armed with 10 torpedo tubes and a deck gun for surface combat. They had enough range to operate across the vast distances of the Pacific, and they could stay at sea for weeks at a time. On paper, they were formidable weapons. In practice, there were problems that wouldn't become apparent until the shooting started. The biggest problem, and the one that would haunt the submarine force for the first 2 years of the war, was the torpedoes. The standard American torpedo was the Mark 14, a sophisticated weapon that used a steam turbine for propulsion and carried a 600-pound warhead. It was designed to run at a preset depth and either strike the target directly or pass underneath and be detonated by a magnetic influence exploder, which would sense the magnetic field of a ship's steel hull and trigger the warhead. The magnetic exploder was supposed to be a major advantage, allowing torpedoes to detonate under a ship's keel, where the explosion would break the vessel's back, rather than just punching a hole in the side. It was clever engineering, and on paper, it looked like a war-winning innovation. The problem was that it didn't work. The Mark 14 torpedo had been developed during the lean years of the 1930s, when budgets were tight and live fire testing was considered too expensive. The torpedo had been tested against theoretical targets and dummy runs, but it had never been fired in anger against real ships under combat conditions. Nobody knew that the depth-keeping mechanism was faulty, causing torpedoes to run deeper than their settings, often passing harmlessly under the target. Nobody knew that the magnetic exploder was unreliable, sometimes detonating too early, sometimes not detonating at all, and sometimes being triggered by the Earth's magnetic field in ways that had nothing to do with the target. And nobody knew that even when the torpedo hit a ship squarely, the contact exploder often failed to function because it was too fragile to survive the impact. American submarine commanders discovered these problems the hard way, in combat, when their carefully aimed torpedoes failed to sink ships that should have gone down. The frustration was immense. A submarine would spend days tracking a target, maneuvering into position at great risk, firing a spread of torpedoes, and then watching in disbelief as the torpedoes either missed, exploded prematurely, or hit the target and failed to detonate. Some commanders reported hearing their torpedoes clang against enemy hulls, and then nothing. No explosion, just the sound of a dud bouncing off into the deep. When submarine commanders complained about the torpedoes, they were often dismissed by the Bureau of Ordnance, the Navy department responsible for weapons development. The Bureau insisted that the torpedoes were fine and that the problem must be with the crews, with poor maintenance, improper settings, or lack of skill. This was infuriating to the men risking their lives on patrol, who knew perfectly well that they were doing everything right and the weapons were failing them. The bureaucratic resistance to admitting there was a problem with the torpedoes delayed fixes for nearly 2 years, during which time countless opportunities to sink enemy ships were lost. It's hard to overstate how damaging this was to the early submarine campaign. Japan was an island nation utterly dependent on imports for its survival. It had almost no domestic oil production, limited food production relative to its population, and had to import virtually all of the raw materials needed for its war industry, including rubber, iron ore, bauxite, and countless other essentials. These materials came by ship from the conquered territories in Southeast Asia, the Dutch East Indies, and elsewhere. If those ships could be sunk faster than Japan could replace them, the Japanese war machine would grind to a halt, regardless of how many battles they won. This was the strategic opportunity that American submarines were perfectly positioned to exploit, and for the first 2 years of the war, faulty torpedoes prevented them from doing so effectively. The submarines went out on patrol, they found targets, they attacked, and far too often, the attacks failed. Japanese ships that should have been on the bottom of the ocean sailed on, carrying oil and supplies that kept the enemy fighting. Every failed torpedo was a gift to Japan, a reprieve that allowed their war economy to function for another day. Despite these handicaps, American submarines did score some successes in the early months of the war. Individual commanders, through skill and persistence, and sometimes sheer luck, managed to sink enemy vessels even with unreliable weapons. The submarine Wahoo, under Commander Dudley Morton, became famous for its aggressive tactics and impressive kill record, proving that American submarines could be deadly even under difficult circumstances. Morton was a different kind of submarine commander, bold and aggressive where others were cautious, willing to take risks that paid off in sunken enemy ships. His example inspired other commanders and helped shift the culture of the submarine force toward a more offensive mindset. But Morton's success was partly due to his willingness to fire large salvos of torpedoes, accepting that many would fail, but hoping that enough would work to sink the target. This was an expensive approach both in terms of the torpedoes expended and the risks taken, and it couldn't fully compensate for the underlying problem with the weapons. The real solution required fixing the torpedoes themselves, and that didn't happen until 1943, after a series of investigations finally convinced the Navy brass that the weapons were defective. The fixes came in stages. First, the magnetic exploder was deactivated, forcing torpedoes to rely on contact detonation only. This eliminated the problems with premature explosions, but didn't solve the issue of duds on contact. That required a redesign of the contact exploder itself, making it more robust so it could survive hitting a ship without breaking. And the depth-keeping problem was addressed by recalibrating the torpedoes to run at their intended depth, rather than 10 or 15 feet deeper. By mid-1943, American submarines finally had torpedoes that worked reliably. The difference was immediate and dramatic. Kill rates soared. Ships that had survived multiple attacks now went down after a single torpedo hit. Submarine commanders who had been frustrated for months suddenly found that their weapons did what they were supposed to do. The Ghost Fleet was finally armed with teeth that could bite. The transformation in American submarine effectiveness coincided with other changes that made the boats even more deadly. New construction was adding submarines to the fleet at an accelerating rate, with the Gato and later Balao-class boats rolling out of shipyards across the country. These were excellent submarines, well suited to the Pacific theater, and they were being produced in numbers that Japan couldn't hope to match. American industrial capacity, which had seemed like an abstraction before the war, was now translating into real fighting power beneath the waves. The crews were improving too. Early in the war, many submarine commanders had been too cautious, a reflection of their peacetime training and the Navy's culture of risk avoidance. As the war progressed, these officers were gradually replaced by younger, more aggressive commanders who had learned from the successes of men like Morton. The submarine force developed a reputation as a place for mavericks and risk-takers, men who were willing to push themselves and their boats to the limit in pursuit of enemy ships. This wasn't recklessness for its own sake. It was a calculated aggression based on understanding that submarines were most effective when used offensively, hunting the enemy rather than waiting to be found. The tactics evolved as well. Early patrols had often been solo affairs, with individual submarines operating independently in assigned patrol areas. This worked reasonably well when targets were plentiful and submarines could find ships without coordinating with each other. But as the war progressed and Japanese shipping became more cautious, traveling in convoys with escorts, the Americans adopted wolf-pack tactics similar to what the Germans were using in the Atlantic. Groups of submarines would coordinate their attacks, overwhelming the escorts and hitting the convoy from multiple directions. This was more complex operationally, requiring good communication and careful planning, but it dramatically increased the effectiveness of each patrol. American submarines also benefited from excellent intelligence. The code breakers at Pearl Harbor and elsewhere had broken Japanese naval codes, providing detailed information about ship movements, convoy routes, and schedules. This intelligence was shared with submarine commanders through a system called Ultra, allowing boats to be positioned along the routes where targets were most likely to appear. Instead of wandering the ocean hoping to stumble across an enemy ship, American submarines could lie in wait, knowing exactly when and where the enemy would pass. This was an enormous advantage, transforming the Pacific from a vast, empty hunting ground into a series of precisely targeted kill zones. The Japanese, for their part, were slow to recognize the scale of the threat they faced. Their navy was focused on the decisive fleet battle that had been the centerpiece of Japanese naval doctrine for decades. Submarines were seen primarily as scouts for the main fleet, useful for reporting enemy movements and perhaps picking off isolated warships, but not as strategic weapons in their own right. Japanese anti-submarine warfare was neglected, with inadequate training, insufficient escorts, and poorly developed doctrine. When American submarines started sinking merchant ships in large numbers, the Japanese Navy was unprepared to respond effectively. This was a critical failure of strategic imagination. Japan's leaders understood, at an intellectual level, that their empire depended on sea transport. They knew that the conquered territories were valuable only if their resources could be shipped back to the home islands. But they didn't translate this understanding into adequate protection for their merchant fleet. Escort vessels were in short supply, convoy systems were implemented late and inconsistently, and anti-submarine tactics remained primitive throughout the war. The Japanese simply never prioritized the defense of their shipping the way the British had in the Atlantic, where the convoy system and aggressive anti-submarine operations eventually defeated the German U-boat threat. Part of the problem was cultural. The Japanese Navy prized offensive action and looked down on defensive duties. Escort work was unglamorous, the sort of assignment that went to officers without prospects rather than rising stars. The best ships and crews were reserved for the fleet actions that might never come, while the merchant ships that actually kept the country alive sailed with minimal protection. This was a catastrophic misallocation of resources, but it was deeply embedded in Japanese naval thinking and proved almost impossible to change, even as losses mounted. By 1944, American submarines had become the most effective anti-ship weapon in the Pacific. They were sinking Japanese merchant vessels faster than Japan could build replacements, and the gap was widening every month. The statistics tell the story in stark terms. In 1942, American submarines sank about 180 Japanese merchant ships, totaling roughly 725,000 tons. In 1943, despite the torpedo problems, the numbers climbed to about 335 ships and 1.5 million tons. And in 1944, with reliable torpedoes and refined tactics, the total soared to over 600 ships and nearly 2.5 million tons. This was devastation on a scale that Japan's economy simply couldn't absorb. The Japanese merchant fleet, which had totaled about 6 million tons at the start of the war, was being ground down relentlessly. New construction couldn't keep pace with losses. Ships that survived attacks were often damaged and needed repairs, further reducing available capacity. The flow of oil from the Dutch East Indies, which had been one of the primary reasons Japan went to war in the first place, slowed to a trickle. Tankers were priority targets for American submarines, and tanker losses were particularly devastating because they couldn't be easily replaced, and because every tanker that went down meant less fuel for the ships, planes, and vehicles that Japan needed to continue fighting. The impact on the Japanese war economy was profound. Factories that depended on imported raw materials had to cut production or shut down entirely. The steel industry, essential for building ships and weapons, was crippled by shortages of iron ore and coking coal. Aluminum production, critical for aircraft manufacturing, declined as bauxite imports were cut off. Even food became scarce, as shipping that might have carried rice and other agricultural products was either sunk or diverted to military uses. The Japanese civilian population, which had already been subject to rationing since the start of the war, faced genuine hunger by 1944 and outright starvation by 1945. This was the silent victory that American submarines were winning beneath the waves. It wasn't dramatic like the great naval battles at Midway or the Philippine Sea. It didn't produce iconic photographs or memorable headlines, but it was strangling Japan as surely as if someone had wrapped a hand around the nation's throat and slowly squeezed. The Japanese called the submarine threat the wolf's fangs, and they feared it above almost anything else. Sailors on merchant ships knew that every voyage might be their last, that somewhere beneath the dark water, American submarines were waiting. The psychological toll was enormous. Ships sailed in fear, crews were constantly on edge, and the knowledge that death could come at any moment from an enemy that couldn't be seen or fought corroded morale throughout the Japanese merchant marine. For the American submariners, the war was a strange mixture of tedium, terror, and exhilaration. Patrols lasted weeks, sometimes months, during which the boat might see no action at all, or might be involved in multiple attacks. Life aboard a submarine was cramped, uncomfortable, and monotonous between engagements. The boats were designed for stealth and combat, not habitability. Crews of 70 or 80 men lived in spaces smaller than most houses, sharing bunks on a rotation system called hot bunking, because the bed was still warm from the previous occupant. Fresh water was rationed, showers were rare luxuries, and the air grew increasingly foul as the patrol wore on. Submariners developed a particular smell, a combination of diesel fuel, sweat, cooking, and the various chemicals that kept the boat running, that marked them as clearly as any uniform. But when action came, everything changed. The approach to a target was a methodical, tense process that could take hours. The submarine would run on the surface at night, using its higher speed to get into position, ahead of the target's expected track. Then it would dive and wait, using sonar to track the approaching ships and the periscope for final targeting. The attack itself was usually over quickly, a matter of minutes from firing torpedoes to either celebrating success or running from counterattack. If the torpedoes hit, there was a grim satisfaction in watching an enemy ship go down, knowing that the war had just become a little shorter. If they missed, or if the convoy's escorts detected the submarine, there was the terrifying experience of being depth-charged, lying silently in the deep while explosions shook the boat, and the crew waited to see if the next one would be close enough to kill them. Depth charging was the great equalizer, the moment when the hunter became the hunted. Japanese anti-submarine forces might have been inadequate overall, but they could still be deadly in individual encounters. A submarine that was detected and pinned down might be attacked for hours, subjected to dozens or even hundreds of depth charges. The concussions would shatter light bulbs, spring leaks, and damage equipment throughout the boat. The crew would sit in near darkness, trying not to make any noise that might give away their position, listening to the propellers of the escorts overhead and the splash of depth charges entering the water. The waiting between the splash and the explosion was agonizing, a few seconds that seemed to stretch forever, as men wondered if this one would be close enough to crack the hull. Some depth chargings lasted for days, with the submarine unable to surface and the escorts refusing to give up the hunt. Crews ran out of fresh air, batteries ran down, and the boat became a sweaty, stinking tomb as carbon dioxide levels rose and oxygen fell. Men would gasp for breath, lose consciousness, revive, and pass out again. It took a special kind of courage to endure that, to keep functioning professionally when every instinct screamed to surface and escape, to trust the boat and the crew and wait for the hunters to finally give up. 52 American submarines were lost during the war, along with over 3,500 submariners. That was the highest casualty rate of any branch of the American military, roughly 22% of those who served. 1 in 5 men who went out on submarine patrol never came home. Some boats simply disappeared, lost without survivors or witnesses to explain what happened. They might have been depth-charged and sunk, or struck mines, or suffered mechanical failures that sent them to the bottom. For these boats, there are no stories, no accounts of what went wrong, just a notation in the records that the submarine departed on patrol and never returned. Families received telegrams informing them that their sons or husbands were missing and presumed dead, and that was all they would ever know. The names of the lost submarines have a somber poetry. Wahoo, which finally met its end in October 1943 after one of the most successful patrol records of the war. Sculpin, sunk in November 1943 with survivors taken prisoner, most of whom died when the transport carrying them to Japan was itself sunk by an American submarine that didn't know prisoners were aboard. Tang, lost in October 1944 when one of its own torpedoes malfunctioned and circled back to hit the boat that had fired it, one of the most tragic and bizarre losses of the war. Fleer, sunk by a mine in August 1944 with only 8 survivors out of a crew of over 80. Each name represents a boat and a crew, men who had families and hopes and futures that ended in the dark waters of the Pacific. Despite the losses, American submarines continued to press their attacks with increasing effectiveness as the war went on. By 1945, there was almost nothing left of the Japanese merchant marine. Ships that had once traveled regular routes between the conquered territories and the home islands now cowered in ports or made desperate dashes through waters that had become hunting grounds for American submarines. The oil shipments that Japan depended on had virtually ceased. The Imperial Japanese Navy, once one of the most powerful in the world, was reduced to an impotent force that couldn't put to sea because it lacked fuel. The massive battleships Yamato and Musashi, the largest ever built, sat at anchor because there wasn't enough oil to operate them. When Yamato finally sortied in April 1945 on a suicide mission against the American fleet at Okinawa, it had only enough fuel for a one-way trip. It was sunk by American aircraft before it reached its destination, a fitting symbol of a navy that had been strangled by submarines long before it was destroyed by planes. The blockade of Japan was so complete by mid-1945 that American submarines were having trouble finding targets. They had, quite literally, run out of ships to sink. The remaining Japanese vessels were either damaged and unable to sail, trapped in ports that had been mined or watched, or so small and insignificant that they weren't worth a torpedo. Submarines that had once reported sinking thousands of tons per patrol now returned with their torpedoes unexpended because there was simply nothing left to shoot at. This was victory, even if it didn't look like the dramatic fleet actions that captured public attention. The Japanese war machine had been choked into submission, not by battleships or carrier strikes, but by the silent, patient work of submarines that had hunted its supply lines into extinction. When the atomic bombs fell on Hiroshima and Nagasaki in August 1945, Japan was already a defeated nation in economic terms. The bombs hastened the end, but the submarines had made that end inevitable. American submarines also played important roles beyond commerce raiding, though these other contributions are often overlooked. They served as scouts and pickets for the fleet, reporting on Japanese movements and providing early warning of enemy attack. They rescued downed aviators, plucking hundreds of pilots from the water after their planes were shot down or ran out of fuel. The submarine Finback rescued a young pilot named George H.W. Bush after his plane was hit during a raid on Chichijima. Bush would go on to become the 41st President of the United States, and he never forgot the submariners who saved his life. Submarines also carried out special operations, landing agents and commandos on enemy-held shores, delivering supplies to guerrilla fighters in the Philippines, and evacuating important personnel from areas about to be overrun. One particularly notable mission involved the submarines Bowfin and others evacuating Army nurses and other civilians from the Philippines ahead of the Japanese invasion. These missions were dangerous and received little publicity, but they demonstrated the versatility of submarines and the courage of the crews who carried them out. The intelligence provided by submarines was invaluable to fleet commanders. Boats on patrol would report sightings of enemy ships and movements, feeding information back to headquarters that helped shape operational planning. Before the Battle of Midway, one of the turning points of the war, submarines provided crucial intelligence about Japanese fleet movements that helped American commanders position their forces for the ambush that destroyed 4 Japanese carriers. The submarines themselves didn't score many hits during that battle, but their reconnaissance contribution was significant. Similarly, throughout the war, submarines provided a constant stream of information about Japanese naval activity that helped American commanders understand what the enemy was doing and predict what they might do next. The human stories of the submarine war are countless and varied. There were commanders who became legends, like Morton of Wahoo, Sam Dealey of Harder, and Richard O'Kane of Tang. Dealey was nicknamed the Destroyer Killer for his aggressive attacks on Japanese escort vessels, actually hunting the hunters in a reversal of the usual submarine role. He was credited with sinking at least 5 destroyers before harder was lost with all hands in August 1944. O'Kane set records for ships sunk and prisoners rescued before the tragic accident that ended Tang's final patrol. He survived the sinking and spent the rest of the war as a Japanese prisoner, later receiving the Medal of Honor for his extraordinary combat record. There were also thousands of ordinary submariners whose names never made the headlines, but whose courage and skill were equally essential to victory. The torpedo men who maintained and loaded the weapons, the motor machinists who kept the engines running, the electricians who managed the batteries, the cooks who somehow produced meals in tiny galleys, the pharmacists' mates who provided medical care without a doctor aboard, and all the others who made up a submarine crew. These men lived and fought and sometimes died, together in a brotherhood forged by shared danger and mutual dependence. Life on a submarine created bonds that lasted lifetimes, and veterans of the submarine service remained close long after the war ended. The submarine force also had a different culture than the surface navy. The nature of submarine operations required initiative and independent judgment from officers and enlisted men alike. A submarine commander on patrol was essentially on his own, making life and death decisions without the ability to consult higher authority. This bred a certain informality and directness that was different from the rigid hierarchy of larger ships. Submarine crews were generally volunteers who had chosen to serve in an elite, dangerous branch, and this self-selection created a sense of pride and exclusivity. Submariners looked down on the surface navy, whom they called targets, and prided themselves on their technical expertise, their ability to function under pressure, and their willingness to take the fight to the enemy. The Japanese never fully grasped the scale of the threat until it was too late. Their focus on the decisive battle, the Mahanian clash of fleets that would determine the war's outcome in a single afternoon, blinded them to the grinding attrition that was actually defeating them. The great battles did come at the Coral Sea and Midway and the Philippine Sea and Leyte Gulf, and Japan lost all of them. But even as the Japanese Navy was being destroyed in these surface and air engagements, their merchant fleet was being annihilated by an enemy they could barely see and couldn't effectively fight. It was a failure of strategic vision that proved fatal. By the time Japanese leaders recognized the submarine threat for what it was, there weren't enough resources left to counter it effectively. The skilled sailors were dead or captured. The shipyards were bombed and short of materials. The escorts that might have protected convoys had never been built in sufficient numbers. Japan had gambled on a short war and lost. The long war that followed was decided beneath the waves as much as above them. The legacy of the American submarine campaign in the Pacific is enormous, though it doesn't always receive the recognition it deserves. The submarine force comprised only about 2% of American naval personnel, but accounted for roughly 55% of all Japanese shipping losses. They sank over 1,300 Japanese ships, totaling more than 5.3 million tons, including a battleship, 8 aircraft carriers, 11 cruisers, and dozens of destroyers and other warships. These numbers represent the most successful naval campaign in American history, a sustained effort that strangled an enemy nation and made ultimate victory possible. The submarines also demonstrated the effectiveness of economic warfare, showing that a determined blockade could bring an industrial nation to its knees without a single soldier setting foot on its territory. This lesson was not lost on post-war military planners, and the submarine has remained a central element of American naval strategy ever since. The atomic submarines that followed, starting with USS Nautilus in 1954, carried the traditions and the institutional knowledge of the World War II submarine force into the nuclear age. The ballistic missile submarines that patrol the world's oceans today, ready to launch devastating retaliatory strikes if deterrence fails, are direct descendants of the fleet boats that hunted Japanese shipping in the Pacific. The Ghost Fleet earned its name because submarines appeared from nowhere, struck without warning, and vanished into the depths before their victims knew what had hit them. Japanese sailors spoke of the American submarines with a mixture of fear and superstitious dread, as if they were supernatural beings rather than machines crewed by mortal men. The ocean itself seemed to have turned against Japan, reaching up with invisible hands to drag their ships down into darkness. There was no safe passage, no route that couldn't be found, no convoy that couldn't be attacked. The Americans seemed to know where Japanese ships would be before the ships themselves did, an effect of the code breaking that Japanese commanders never fully understood or countered. To be a sailor on a Japanese merchantman in 1944 or 1945 was to live under a constant sentence of death, waiting for the torpedoes that might come at any moment. That psychological warfare was as important as the physical destruction. Japan's maritime workforce was demoralized, traumatized by repeated losses and constant fear. Ships sailed undermanned because crews deserted or refused to serve. Captains took unnecessary risks trying to avoid submarines, sometimes running aground or colliding with other vessels. The whole maritime economy was paralyzed by fear of an enemy that struck from beneath and couldn't be seen or predicted. This was the Ghost Fleet's greatest achievement, not just sinking ships, but making it impossible for Japan to use the sea that surrounded it, turning the Pacific from a highway into a graveyard. The men who accomplished this deserve to be remembered. They volunteered for one of the most dangerous jobs in the military, knowing the risks and accepting them because the job needed to be done. They served on boats where a single mistake, a faulty seal, a missed depth charge, a malfunctioning piece of equipment could mean death for the entire crew. They spent weeks at sea in conditions that would challenge anyone's endurance, then went out and did it again as soon as their boats were ready. And more than 3,000 of them never came home, giving their lives in a campaign that helped end the worst war in human history. The submarine force received less recognition than it deserved during and after the war. The secrecy surrounding submarine operations, necessary for security reasons, meant that the public didn't learn about many of the most heroic and successful missions until long after they happened. The silent service lived up to its name, doing its work in obscurity while other branches received the headlines and the glory. But the men who served knew what they had accomplished, and the Navy recognized their contribution with an outsized share of medals and commendations. 7 submarine commanders received the Medal of Honor during the war, and countless others received lesser decorations for acts of courage that would have been headline news if they had happened where reporters could see them. The boats themselves are mostly gone now, scrapped or sunk as targets after the war. A few survive as museum ships, preserved so that later generations can walk through the same compartments where young men once lived and fought. The USS Bowfin is at Pearl Harbor, within sight of the Arizona Memorial, a reminder that the American response to that infamous attack included a silent fleet that exacted a terrible vengeance. The USS Pampanito is at San Francisco, the USS Silversides at Muskegon, Michigan, the USS Drum at Mobile, Alabama. These boats are cramped and rusty now, but they still carry the echoes of the men who served aboard them, and visiting them is as close as most of us can come to understanding what submarine warfare was actually like. I think there's something important in this story beyond the military history. It's a reminder that wars are not always won by the side with the biggest guns or the most dramatic victories. Sometimes they're won by persistence and patience, by showing up every day and doing the unglamorous work that needs to be done. The submarine campaign was not exciting in the way that carrier battles or amphibious assaults were exciting. It was methodical, repetitive, and often frustrating. But it was decisive in a way that many flashier operations were not. The submarines won their war by economics, by math, by the simple arithmetic of sinking more ships than the enemy could build or survive without. The Japanese were defeated not in a moment of glory, but by a slow, relentless pressure that gave them no rest and no hope. There's a lesson there about strategy and patience that applies beyond the military context. Sometimes the right approach isn't the dramatic one. Sometimes it's the steady, patient accumulation of small victories that adds up to total triumph. The submarine commanders who went out patrol after patrol, sinking one ship at a time, weren't trying to win the war in a single afternoon. They were trying to win it over months and years, one torpedo at a time. And they did. The story of America's Ghost Fleet is also a story about ordinary people rising to extraordinary challenges. The men who served on submarines weren't special when they started out. They were farmers and factory workers, students and salesmen, young men from every part of America who had probably never thought about submarines before the war. They learned their trade in training. They perfected it in combat. And many of them became genuinely skilled professionals who could operate complex machinery under terrifying conditions. The war made them into something they couldn't have imagined becoming, and most of them went back to ordinary lives when it was over, carrying their experiences with them, but rarely talking about them. That pattern of ordinary people doing extraordinary things, then returning to ordinary life, is one of the defining characteristics of American military history. We don't have a warrior caste or a professional military tradition in the same way that some other nations do. Our wars have been fought mostly by citizens who became soldiers for the duration and then went home. The submariners were the same way. They stepped up when they were needed, did what had to be done, and then stepped back into civilian life. Many of them never told their families what they had experienced, partly because it was painful to remember and partly because the people who hadn't been there couldn't really understand. They were the quiet generation, doing their duty without asking for recognition or thanks. The ghost fleet that haunted Japan's nightmares was crewed by these quiet men, and their accomplishment deserves to be remembered and honored. They fought a war that was brutal and ugly, as all wars are, but they fought it in a cause that was just, against enemies whose aggression and atrocities demanded response. They endured hardships that would break most people. They lost friends and shipmates to the merciless sea, and they kept going until the job was done. When the war ended and the submarines came home, they had played a role in victory that was larger than most Americans realized then or realize now. This has been another story from Great American Classics. Before we finish, it's worth taking a moment to remember the men who served on those boats, and especially the more than 3,000 who gave their lives beneath the Pacific. They were young men, most of them, with their whole lives ahead of them, and they sacrificed everything so that others could live in freedom. The submarines they served on are mostly gone now, but the memory of what they accomplished should never fade. They were the Ghost Fleet, silent and deadly, and they helped win a war that determined the future of the world. Their sacrifice isn't something we should ever forget, and their story still matters today. Thank you for listening.